stage is your van.
All right.
Good luck.
So, hello everyone and welcome. My name is Jos Wetzels and I'm a security researcher with Forescout's Fedora Labs. And today I will be talking about a bundle of operational technology vulnerabilities dubbed OTICEFALL, which we released this year. So a little bit about Fedora Labs. We're the threat intelligence arm of Forescout. We're a vendor of control and visibility solutions aimed at OT, IoT, medical devices, and so on. And we work in intelligence generation, attack prediction, and threat research. And this is part of one of our research programs. So, as most of you are likely well aware, more than a decade ago, the company Digital Bond initiated Project Basecamp. Just for a show of hands, how many people are familiar with Project Basecamp? Not that many. So Project Basecamp was modeled after the Firesheep project, and it aimed to show that most ICS OT devices had a basic lack of security control, so no security whatsoever. They looked into multiple products by a lot of different vendors, and they found what is by now common knowledge, that a lot of OT products lack the most basic of security controls. Now, this lack of basic security controls has its roots in the historical deployment of this kind of stuff in trusted air-gapped networks, but that situation is now a very distant past, and IT and OT are more interconnected than ever before, also as the previous presentation showed, and even wireless and cloud technologies are making some headway in this space. Now, in the past decade, a lot has changed in OT security too. First of all, in terms of awareness, people are aware of this problem now. They're recognizing it, that something should be done about it. And secondly, with the advent of various standards-driven security efforts, such as IEC 62443, NERC CIP, you name it. But what you see if you look at OT CVEs is that time and again, trivial vulnerabilities continue popping up in OT products. And since we get a lot of customer asks to look into or support a specific OT system, we set out to do a checkup of the progress that has been made essentially in the past 10 years on the insecure by design front by taking a quantitative approach in the actually deployed install base among various parties. So the first thing you might ask is, if insecure by design is such a well-known issue, why revisit it? Why bother talking about it again? Well, the problem is that if you want to do effective risk management, that is complicated by any sort of opacity. If you want to know whether real progress is being made on this front, or what is actually under the hood of new security controls that are being introduced, you will need to dig a little deeper than just the surface level assumptions that people have been making. You cannot simply assume that every proprietary system that you encounter is and will always remain broken in the same ways. Security mechanisms are sometimes retrofitted onto insecure protocols, so your judgment calls from 5 years ago might no longer hold. Authentication implementations change over time, etc., etc. In addition, it's also not enough to know whether something is insecure, because that doesn't mean anything. You need to know in what way it is insecure. So it matters a lot whether I'm able to change a particular set point, for example, change a temperature or a pressure rating, or if I'm able to get remote code execution on a device and bypass any sort of intrinsic limitations. And you will need to know that kind of info to justify the right compensating controls that you might need to take. So it's very important to do this checkup now and then. So let's start with a brief overview of the issues. In total, we uncovered 56 issues affecting more than 10 vendors, and this includes all kinds of vendors and all kinds of industry verticals, DCSs, which are distributed control systems, such as Emerson Delta V, which is very big in oil and gas, and Ovation, which is very big in power generation. It also includes safety controllers like the Honeywell Safety Manager and PLCs that are used in both manufacturing and building control, like the Saya Burgess PCD, the Omron Sysmac, the Yokogawa Stardom, you name it. Of the vulnerabilities that we uncovered, well, it didn't surprise us, but what did strike us is that the majority consisted of trivial issues, as you can see on the right. These are not complicated vulnerabilities. They consist of compromise of credentials, firmware manipulation issues, and some very trivial ways to get remote code execution, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So we disclosed these issues to the vendors through CISA, which is a US government body, providing a disclosure deadline of at least 90 days ahead of the release of the report, and in some cases extending it. Unfortunately, the vendor responses, they varied a lot. Some acknowledged the receipt of our reports, but only started in-depth investigations very close to the deadlines. So there was a little bit of a hectic situation around that. And as a result, some issues are still in disclosure. Then some vendors wanted the details to be restricted only to product bulletins, so that only certain customers would be notified and not the general public. In other cases, we had more pleasurable experiences where vendors confirmed to us that these reports actually invigorated their internal secure protocol development efforts. So that's a win in my book. If you want a detailed overview of all the different vulnerabilities, the affected versions, and the detailed mitigations, on the links that are in the slide, you can see the CISA and the vendor advisories, which contain a full guidance. We did not disclose full technical details of all these vulnerabilities for the simple reason that a lot of these vulnerabilities are inherent to these system designs. In some cases, they will be essentially forever days. Some of them will not get patched. They will only get workarounds and mitigations. And once you are able to reproduce this vulnerability, it's usually fairly trivial. So there is really a balance to be made here, whether you want to put that out in public in full. So let's take a deeper dive into a recurring category of issues: broken authentication schemes and improper fixes for them. So while a lot of OT systems lack any sort of security controls, as I just mentioned, it has become more common over the past decade to integrate at least some sort of authentication schemes to sensitive operator or engineering interfaces. Now, in practice, these, however, are often, and not just often, but almost always of subpar quality. And I'll give some examples of that. The first of that is the Siemens WinCC OA SCADA system. It's a very popular SCADA system used in oil and gas, in water management, but also at CERN. It has an operator UI, which is where the industrial operator, think Homer Simpson, he logs in and he talks essentially to a dedicated proxy which wraps a proprietary insecure protocol. So this is a protocol that has no security measures whatsoever. They wrap it in TLS, and then they have a couple of authentication methods on top of that. And there's 3 modes for that. The first mode is, well, as it says, client-side authentication, which used to be the default prior to version 3.17. And this is the preferred version for single sign-on integration. So if you want to couple this kind of authentication to your Active Directory or whatever, you do it through this mode. Then you have server-side authentication that has become the default since 3.17, and then you have the option to integrate with Kerberos. The problem with client-side authentication is that it stores the credentials as database points in the SCADA database. And then essentially what the client does is when I try to log in, it asks the database, can you give me all the users and the passwords, and I'll check them locally whether that is a right fit. So an attacker can just write a malicious client that doesn't do that and talk directly to the database, and on top of that, they can also fetch the credentials. Now, this wouldn't be that much of an issue if this wasn't the mode that is required to get it coupled to your Active Directory. So a lot of people are kind of stuck in a catch-22 here. Another thing we took a look at that was kind of exemplary of failures of authentication is the Motorola MDLC protocol. It's a SCADA protocol that is used to communicate between the central SCADA location, as you can see there, to an RTU over a wide area network, and that can be transported over anything from IP to serial to radio to microwave, you name it. Now, it doesn't have explicit authentication, but there are 2 modes of encryption based on a pre-shared key that you program into the SCADA and into the RTU. Now, in the newer RTUs, there's a mode that's based on AES 256. But in the older modes, there is an undocumented mode that turned out to use the tiny encryption algorithm in ECB mode. And this mode is supported by newer RTUs for backwards compatibility and mixed network reasons up until this disclosure. Of course, people with some basic knowledge of cryptography, they will know that using any block cipher in ECB mode means you're opening yourself up to a host of issues, like known plaintext issues, block swapping attacks, since it guarantees integrity and confidentiality only at the block level and not at the ciphertext level, as illustrated by the notorious ECB penguin on the right. Next are the Saya Burgess PCD PLCs. These are PLCs that you see a lot in, for example, gas control networks, but also the more high-tech building automation. They use a protocol called SBus over port 5050 UDP. It's originally a serial protocol. It's master-slave based. And it does have some sort of authentication. What it does is essentially you perform a write operation to a static memory address, and then it says, you're authenticated or not. The problem is that the authentication happens by sending a 32-bit hash derived from a CRC check to the PLC without a nonce. So it's not a secure hash, and on top of that, there's no freshness, so it's vulnerable to every attack in the book. There's collisions, there's replay attacks, and to finish it off, it doesn't really matter how well they would have implemented this algorithm because they do the authentication based on an IP whitelist, and it's a UDP protocol. So, yeah. Another interesting case with some overlap here are the issues that we found with the Emerson control wave PLC. They're very popular in transport pipeline, gas transport pipeline control. And they use a proprietary protocol called BSEP IP, which again, it's an old serial protocol that was lifted on top of IP. It has password authentication for engineering operations, like starting and stopping the PLC and changing the logic. But again, it enforces this using a MAC IP whitelist for a UDP protocol, rather than doing at least cryptographic message binding for each subsequent message. Now, on top of that, there are 3 authentication modes here. There's the original one, which they now call simple. That's a 1 to 6 character plain text password that gets sent over the wire. Very simple indeed. Then there is a secure mode that they introduced. And what you do here is if I want to authenticate to the PLC sends me an 8-bit key. I take that 8-bit key and I encrypt my password using that 8-bit key, and I send it to the PLC, and it checks, is that the same password? Well, that's trivially broken for various reasons. I mean, 8 bits is not much of a key, plus this is not how you do a challenge response, because the key goes over the wire. Now they have secure mode 2, which is undocumented, but is used in the newest firmware versions. And what they essentially just did is they now use a 64-bit key and a slightly different encryption algorithm. This is just a showcase of a bad design 3 times over. In many cases, these systems can migrate to more secure versions because of reasons of backwards compatibility, legacy, the complication in updating firmware, all that sort of stuff. But apparently they had the chance at least twice here, but still missed that option. According to Emerson, however, these issues are not vulnerabilities. They feel these issues are adequately addressed in the control wave manual, which you can see an excerpt of on the slide. And what they say for enhanced security, you can install a VPN and a firewall. Now, this is misleading in my opinion because enhanced security implies that this other stuff is basic security, and I don't think that's exactly true. And secondly, if you look at the reference design on the right of the slide, it just recommends a site-to-site VPN, which doesn't solve the issue being exploited at the local site level. And that can be okay, that can be an acceptable risk trade-off, but people need to be informed that this is the residual risk they're exposed to if they do it this way. That doesn't happen. An example of an incomplete rather than an improper bug fix is something we found in the Yokogawa Stardom PLCs. They're very big in power and mining, to give you a little bit of context. They have a telnet maintenance interface that has had multiple prior issues with hard-coded credentials, 2 CVEs in 2018. Even though these issues were fixed, we found yet another set of hard-coded credentials affecting duplex controllers on the same interface in the same piece of the firmware. And this isn't really interesting. I mean, it's hard-coded credentials, whatever. But what is interesting is that it is an indication that bugs are fixed point-wise. They get a report of a vulnerability, they fix it, they push a new firmware, that's it. But they don't follow it up with variant hunting in code that is like right next to it. And that is really, really damning in my opinion here. Finally, we found an example pointing towards a similar lack of variant hunting with the Emerson Delta V DCS controllers, which are very big in oil and gas. First of all, most controllers up until the most recent version had hard-coded credentials for the so-called read-only telnet interface. In addition, several other hard-coded credentials were present, and they are technically tied on the outside to FTP and SSH interfaces, but if you get access through another interface, they can be used for privilege escalation. And unfortunately, the official advisory doesn't mention this, so I think it's important to get that out. In addition, these hard-coded credentials, the maintenance telnet interface, which offers shell access to the underlying real-time operating system, uses an insecure authentication algorithm up to a fairly recent version, after which it was silently patched. This authentication algorithm essentially consists of a homebrew cryptography algorithm, which takes no secret, just a very predictable seed that is smaller than 16 bits. So as long as you know the algorithm, you can brute force the seed, or you can probably even predict it, and you get access to a shell on this controller. Now, this is not the first time that Delta V has suffered from issues like this. They've had hard-coded credential issues before, and apparently they didn't follow that up by looking at all this low-hanging fruit that has been in here since, well, at least the 2014 CVE that was reported earlier. And these examples kind of lead me to my next point, which is maybe a bit controversial, but nonetheless important. What can we expect of OT product security certification today? And I'll take a little bit of water before I'll get to that. So what we found was that the majority of the affected product families had some form of security certification, even though the issues that they suffered from were fairly trivial issues. I mean, this stuff is not rocket science. This is kind of problematic in my opinion, because while security certifications, they obviously aren't a guarantee that something is unhackable, and there's a lot of like nuance to at what level they get certified, they are often seen as a seal of approval for meeting a certain minimum bar, which some of these products simply don't meet. And in my opinion, that leads to a false sense of security. So there are several issues contributing to this problem, which I won't get into in detail, but I do think it is important that for all of these insecure by design issues, at least the ones which are not broadly known, there is some sort of an independent artifact in the form of a report or a CVE that certification laboratory auditors can refer to when they're doing these audits, because they don't have a lot of time to do these audits. They're often not subject matter experts on OT technology, so they need some sort of a reference to say, look, this protocol, I can't look into it in depth, but it doesn't meet the criteria that it should meet. To give a more detailed example of this going wrong, let's take a look at the IEC 62443-4-2 substandard for component security requirements. So how many people are familiar with this standard? Not a lot. So basically you have different security levels, and at the lowest security level, it's not really a hard security guarantee, it's more to prevent inadvertent misuse and stuff like that. But it still has some requirements that, if they are met at the lowest security level, they also apply to the higher ones. So once you get certified at security level 1, then usually people move on to security levels, and they say, oh, this was already, covered in security level 1. So it matters what people get certified for at those lower levels. Now, if you look at the slide, you can see there are requirements for human user identification. There are requirements for software and information integrity, and these things are not being met in the security sense. So how do we rhyme these ubiquitous, unauthenticated interfaces, unauthenticated logic downloads, and the ability to tamper with software with these requirements, which apparently they met before they got the stamp of approval? Another example would be the 4-1 substandard, which is a standard that governs setting up secure development life cycles, which explicitly states that root cause identification and variant hunting are requirements of a SDLC, as they should be. Then I don't have an answer to this, but I think an important question is, how is it possible that two major vendors with certified SDLCs have clearly failed to either identify root causes of fairly trivial issues, or failed to identify the most simple related security issues like other hard-coded credentials on the same interface? Is this because they're still relatively immature? Is this because something is going wrong in these SDLCs? I don't know exactly, but I think people should be focusing a little bit more on this. And finally, regarding the same 4-1 standard on SDLCs and slightly related, a standard by General Electric called the Achilles Product Certification Standard, they have a requirement that states explicitly that an SDLC should guarantee products are tested for abuse cases. In other words, they should be fuzzed. Now, the Achilles ACC certification, if you look at the slide, actually claims that using the Achilles test platform to do a whole bunch of systematic fuzzing in specific protocol stack layers. However, if you look at which devices are ACC certified, even at security level 2, it includes a host of like real-time operating system and devices that in recent years have been found vulnerable to memory corruption flaws in TCP/IP stacks, which we and some other security companies uncovered that were, to be honest, also quite trivial. It didn't take a lot of fuzzing to find these. So the question is, if this is a requirement and if this is being done, who is doing the fuzzing here? And who fuzzes the fuzzers? Now, all of these examples lead to the question, when is something actually secure by design? What does this mean? Now, in this research alone, we found 22 CVEs related to broken authentication, while if we look at a selection of similar issues in prior work, we could find at least 28 CVEs with similar root causes in the last 5 years. So this is not an issue of certain vendors. It is not an issue of a snapshot in time. It is not an issue of cherry picking something. This is a broad issue among security controls if they are present in OT. That's worrying because, in my opinion, a false sense of security is actually worse than a clear sense of insecurity. Because if you have a clear sense of insecurity, you can take the right compensated controls. Well, if you have a false sense of security, well, you think you're good while you might not be. So what can we expect of product security standards? Well, I think they serve a purpose. This is not to say, you know, standards, throw them in the bin. That's definitely not the case. They've advanced security in many areas a lot. They have a role to play, but I think their track record deserves more scrutiny than it has been getting so far. Most standards have functional requirements stating that something has capability X or something shall have capability Y, and then it needs to be functionally validated. So if it needs authentication requirements, people check, oh, is there a pop-up box with a password, but not like, how robust is this? This, in my opinion, adds very little. So yeah, people should look into this in more depth. Finally, secure by design is not enough. We need secure by default. You shouldn't say, oh, you know, it's not secure out of the box, but there's this hardening guidance all the way at the end of the 600-page manual, which you need to follow, and then you also need a subscription to our support services to get, you know, the reference document with the reference architecture. No, make it secure by default, because otherwise people are going to get enough rope to hang themselves with. Now, during the research, there's some classes of issues that require a bit of nuance when looking at them in both directions, and their impact, and we'll briefly go over some of them. So, first of all, there's the issue of supply chain vulnerabilities, or vulnerabilities that originate in some component high up the supply chain and end up trickling down. In the past few years, we've seen more and more of these issues across the technology stack in OT, from real-time operating systems to SDKs to protocol stacks to runtimes to remote access solutions, you name it. Now, what typically happens is that a vulnerability affecting some supply chain component is usually not discovered in that component. It's discovered in a product incorporating that component, and then that is reported as belonging to that vendor. It doesn't make its way up the supply chain, let alone then back again to everybody else in the supply chain. And this is a recurring issue also in broader embedded sectors, in some cases because the vendors don't even know who uses everything down the supply chain. They might have a view of some OEMs and some component vendors, but then it goes blind for them as well. So these kind of situations lead to unnecessary vulnerability collisions and risk blindness, which we found an example of as well. This is the ProconOS runtime. It's a logic runtime now owned by Phoenix Contact, and it's used by their products, but also by many OEMs and integrators and white label vendors under many different integration conditions. So this is used to execute PLC logic, and you can use different versions of this runtime. You can use it with your own protocol. You can use it with 2 different versions of their protocols. There's very complicated different setups that make external fingerprinting a little bit of a pain in the something. Now, what we frequently encountered is that a particular PLC in a customer environment which we were looking at, after some investigation, turned out to run, again, Procon OS. But this wasn't immediately clear. Like, you couldn't find it in documents. You couldn't really see it always on the outside that clearly. And the problem here is that Procon OS, like many of these runtimes, has a history of vulnerabilities, such as unauthenticated protocols, remote code execution through unsigned logic, all that kind of stuff. And there have been proof of concepts available for this on the internet for years. In some cases, issues have been known without assigned CVEs. So people are deploying these assets in their environment. They think, oh, well, there's no CVE for my device. It must be good. But under the hood, you've been running something that has been vulnerable for God knows how long. Now, due to the lack of software bills of materials in this case, vulnerabilities end up getting rediscovered. For example, there's a CVE for the Yokogawa Stardom PLC, which in no way seems related to this issue. There's no details on it. There's nothing, no ways to detect it. It's just a rediscovery 2 years later of that same Phoenix Contact CVE. It's the same thing. Could have been known already, and that's unfortunate. So what we did was we looked at some other PLCs and vendors that incorporate this runtime, and you can see that on the right. And we hope that this eventually makes its way down to the right CVE, but time will tell. The next example are firmware updates. Malicious firmware updates in OT context are a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, they're noisy. It requires a reboot. It will likely interrupt the process, trigger all sorts of alarms. But they are very powerful because they allow for persistence, they allow for mask breaking. It's a powerful vector. And we found that only 51% of the products that we looked at had some sort of authentication on the update interface. Only 22% performed some sort of firmware signing at all. And usually this was combined. So no authentication in order to push the update and then no signing on the firmware. And the majority of these updates occurred over Ethernet. That's a big risk factor. In some cases, the risk is a little bit reduced because updates were only done over USB, over serial, over SD card. That reduces the risk, but then you still need to think, what about when a media converter or an engineering workstation gets compromised? So the caveat here is that if you do signing as a vendor, you need to do it right. You need to do it end-to-end, and you need to do it in an asymmetric fashion. An example where this doesn't go completely right are the Emerson Delta V DCS controllers that I also discussed earlier. These controllers speak a variety of unauthenticated proprietary protocols which allow for, doing essentially everything. In addition, prior to version 14.3, controller firmwares are, signed using CRC, so they're unsigned. Now, Emerson considers this issue resolved in 14.3 because in that version, the update tool on the engineering workstation now validates an RSA signature in the firmware manifest file before flashing it to the controller. But this really only protects the firmware as it travels from the vendor to the engineering workstation, and then it's open. It doesn't protect anyone in between. Emerson considers that not to be much of an issue because they say, well, if you follow the reference architecture that we have, all the controllers in the area control network, they're segmented away from the workstations by a firewall IPD. And this firewall IPD has the possibility to drop a message which is used to put them in update mode. So, you can be segmented away from that, which is fine 90% of the time, but sometimes real-world firmware updates have to happen. So an attacker can still lie in wait with a malicious firmware update until a legitimate window opens up in the firewall and then push this malicious firmware update. And it's unfortunate that this is still considered somewhat of a non-issue in these sensitive environments. So a second point that requires some nuance are vulnerabilities related to unsigned PLC logic. Generally speaking, as shown on the bottom of the slide, a PLC logic is typically compiled to either native machine code for some sort of like a microcontroller, these days a lot of PPC and ARM, or they're translated to some sort of a bytecode or scripting language that's then interpreted. This is fed to a logic runtime, and that executes it either directly on the CPU through a code loader, runs it on a VM, or dispatches it to a dedicated ASIC or FPGA, which handles logic execution. In the controllers we looked at, the vast majority executes their logic as native machine code, and none of them sign this logic. Only a handful do some sandboxing. So if you combine this fact with the fact that most of these PLCs have real-time operating systems that lack support on part of the operating system or the MMU to do any sort of memory and privilege separation, this leads to situations where usually the ability to download logic is not just the ability to manipulate whatever is going on in the ICS, but to get code execution at a very deep level on these PLCs. It's essentially execute my shellcode, please. And this matters since the direct impact differs quite a bit between these architectures. To give you an example of that, consider the Omron Sysmax C families compared to the newer N families. Essentially, the difference is that on the older families, they used an ASIC for the execution of the bytecode. So if I can modify this bytecode because it's not signed, I can make, you know, the industrial logic go haywire, but I'm still limited to whatever, you know, is being done on inherent safety checks on a device. I don't have native code execution, so I cannot use it as an attack platform to maybe pivot deeper into serial networks and stuff like that. That's not the case for the newer version of the PLC, because people are moving away from these ASICs, they're moving away from these FPGA architectures towards more commodity platforms running on an ARM chip with a more common RTOS, in some cases even real-time Linux. So that means that this same vulnerability has a very different impact between two product lines that you need to be aware of if you want to make the adequate compensating controls. One example of the difference in the other direction is the Honeywell Safety Manager. This is a SIL 3 rated safety controller used in various critical applications. The engineering software is called Safety Station, and it compiles the safety instrumented function diagrams, again, to unsigned native machine code. This is then wrapped in a project file, and it's downloaded to the PLC through an unauthenticated interface. And after receiving this logic, it transmits it across the backplane to the hard CPU module, which then executes it essentially unconstrained. Now, interestingly, this issue does not apply to the newer generation here, the S300, because here the safety instrumented diagrams are compiled to bytecode, which are executed on a VM. So maybe it's possible to break out there, but that takes another VM escape, and that makes it a very different kind of vulnerability. Finally, there's some nuance to be made regarding to mode switches. So what you typically have on a lot of PLCs and industrial control devices is you can regulate the mode it is running on. So I can say, execute your logic, and then I turn a switch and set it in run mode, or I can say I want to program it now and I put it in program mode or idle mode. And these are safety measures. These are not historically security measures. These are ways to prevent engineers from doing something very stupid while they're working on a plant. But they are possible to use as a very good security mechanism against unwanted logic downloads. If you have a mode switch that says, I'm in run mode now and I don't accept downloads, then during operations, you're safe from malicious logic downloads. Now, the pitfalls here is that not all of these mode switches are the same. You want distinctness. You want a distinct run and program mode. You don't want them combined, because then engineers will leave them in this combined mode forever. You also don't want virtual switches, which are switches that can be overridden in software. So people set it in hardware, but in the engineering software, you might still be able to override it. You also need to be wary of exception modes. So some of them have an exception mode that say if you can configure the PLC in this or that way, then it ignores the mode switch. And finally, you need to be wary of what are the defaults. And we found that only a minority, 17% of the devices that we looked at, have actually these full mode switch type of support. An example of this is again the Emerson Control Wave PLC. Firmware updates here are unsigned, and this is troubling given that, as I previously discussed, they happen over this BSEP IP protocol with all the discussed issues. Again, even despite this fact, Emerson didn't consider this a vulnerability either. because they said they have a key switch and it can be set to run mode, and then there's a configuration setting which can disable any remote changes. But the problem is that the key switch also has a remote mode, which is a combined run and program mode. And knowing engineers, for practical reasons, they're going to leave it in that. And if you aren't very explicit about that in the manual, that is going to happen. And then this configuration setting, it's not enabled by default. And if you enable it, you can't do any remote engineering anymore. So, yeah. A final example of why there's a lot of ifs and buts to mode switches is the Honeywell Safety Manager again. We just saw logic downloads are unsigned there and unauthenticated, and they can give an attacker remote code execution in the heart of the safety controller. Luckily, there's quite a few key switches involved, and these are actually an example of a good design of key switches. The Safety Manager, before you do a download, you have to put it in idle mode, then you do your download, then you turn the key switch, and then you have to do a fault reset on another module. So there's a lot of physical interaction and physical presence involved that acts as a mitigating factor, except when the remote load reset setting is enabled. And this is a setting that you can enable, and then it essentially ignores these switches. Now, this can be a legitimate engineering choice, but you need to be able to be aware of this, and you need to document this in your information security management system, because otherwise you have a major blind spot if you think you're going to be saved by these key switches. So with that, let's take a quick look at some of the reverse engineering effort that went into understanding some of these protocols and systems analyzed as part of this research, so we can get a bit of a feeling for the attacker effort that might be required to replicate these kind of capabilities. So in terms of SCADA, DCS, and engineering software, what we looked at were mostly Windows software packages that were typically very huge. So multiple gigabytes of code, hundreds of DLLs, and a lot of nasty code, MFC, ATL.com, Qt libraries on top of it. So quite a bit of reverse engineering involved. The vast majority of it was also written in C++, which is sometimes more of a pain in the ass than actually obfuscation measures. And while the embedded devices that we looked at typically resemble, non-consumer devices, increasingly ARM plus Linux, something like that, there are a lot of devices that are still PowerPC plus VxWorks or QNX, stuff like that. And there are very specific regional outliers. So you see in Asia, for example, a lot of OS9 and Itron on Super H. And I mean, if you don't have all the IDA scripts lying around for that, you need to write a lot of stuff. And it comes on top of it. All in all, the systems that we looked at do represent a selection of typical non-trivial OT code bases to reverse engineer. Regardless, we looked at our numbers and we found that reversing a single proprietary protocol typically took anywhere between a day and 2 man-weeks, while reversing a complex multi-protocol system has taken us in some cases up to 6 man-months. So these are the efforts that come with just reverse engineering it up to a fair high point of granularity. In some cases, essentially rebuilding parsers and crafters. While this is quite a bit of effort, it is, in my opinion, within the capabilities of a fairly small team with the right incentives, rather than being the sole domain of very large organizations. It's different if you start talking about the follow-up, like OT payloads and cyber-physical impacts. That's a different ballgame. But when it comes to developing specifically these kind of capabilities, it doesn't take a very huge team to do this. And that brings us to the mitigations and the conclusions. In conclusion, we've seen that insecure by design issues continue to persist in the production install base and critical infrastructure everywhere, despite more than a decade of hardening efforts. In order to address this, we will need to get clearer on what secure by design actually means. And it shouldn't be just a buzzword that people throw out there. For one, many security controls that are implemented turn out to be trivially broken. A first-year bachelor student computer science can find most of these issues. And that is across the board, including in certified products. So something to keep in mind. Glaring vulnerabilities are sometimes still dismissed because of advice pointing to compensating controls, and then it turns out that these compensating controls not always fully compensate. Something that will also need to be addressed, in my opinion. we see quite a few security retrofits of an old legacy protocol on top of a newer protocol, and that completely misses the point, like doing IP-based access control for UDP protocols, not knowing how challenge response is supposed to work. And fixes frequently don't either address the root cause or they don't do any sort of variant hunting. And this is really where the cheap wins are, in my opinion. Finally, like I mentioned earlier, devices should be secure by default out of the box. And I'd like to close out with a common call to action that's been made a gazillion times before, but it's going to be made a gazillion times again. First of all, device manufacturers should really start properly securing these devices and these protocols. Asset owners should actively procure for secure products and not just based on standards compliance, but for example, including device pen tests in their RFPs when they're building new greenfield products, stuff like that. And the wider security community should continue to ensure that security controls that pop up in OT products are actually robust and not just some form of Potemkin security. So keep hammering on these devices, and eventually we might get there. And that's it.
Thank you.